We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara and Mesechet Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 5a. On the previous summit, the Gemara was dealing with the halach in the Mishnah that by all karbonos except for carbon chatas and carbon pesach, if a person brings the carbon shelo lishma, means not for the sake of that carbon, so the carbon itself is still kosher. However, it does not fulfill the obligation of the owner. And the Gemara in the previous summit brought two psukim for this idea. One was the pasuk of Zos HaTorah, which compares all the karbonos to one another, and the other is the pasuk of Motzos Fasecha, which talks about fulfilling one's oath. And so the Gemara now is in the middle of explaining why we need both psukim. If we only had the pasuk of Motzos Fasecha, so lo yadinon b'mai, so we wouldn't know what exactly the pasuk is talking about, meaning we wouldn't know the pasuk is talking about lishma. So kasav rachmana Zos HaTorah, the pasuk writes Zos HaTorah for that reason, so that we know it's talking about lishma. Because of Rachmana Zos HaTorah, and if the pasuk only wrote Zos HaTorah, Hava Amina Lifsalu, I would think it's completely puzzle. Because of Rachmana Motzos Fasecha, the pasuk writes Motzos Fasecha to say again the carbon itself is kosher. It just does not fulfill the owner's obligation. And Rashi explains, Lo yadinam b'mai kamar achmana motzos vasecha tishmar. I wouldn't know what the pasuk is talking about when it says motzos vasecha tishmar. To haloksib behedya b'haikra avodos lishma. It doesn't say explicitly in this pasuk anything about doing the avodah lishma. V'dil malav b'lishma and mishtoi kra. So maybe the pasuk is not talking about lishma. So kasav rachmana zos haTorah lameilaf mishlamim d'mefar shabu lishma. That's why the pasuk says zos haTorah. We learn from carbon shlamim. There it's talking about lishma, and so therefore we understand again that we're talking about lishma over here. And the Gemara continues, Rami Reish Lakish al Ma'ohi Bei Midrasha Umakshi. Reish Lakish was lying on his stomach in the Beis Medrash, and he asked the following question. Im Ksherim Heim, if these karbonos, again this is talking about all karbonos except for the carbon chadas and the carbon pesach, if they are kosher, so then yirtzu. So if they're kosher, they should also fulfill the obligation of the owner. Via main maratzin, if they don't fulfill the obligation of the owner, so lama boin, so why is it that we're bringing these karbonos? What does it mean that it's kosher, but it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner? And the Gemara continues, Amar lo Rebbe Elazar said to him, he responded to Reish Lakish, Matzinu bevoin la'achar misa. We do find this idea somewhere else. When you have a carbon that comes after the death of the owner, shehin kasherin, we say that the carbon is kosher, ve'in meratzin, but still it's not going to be a kapara, it's not going to be an atonement for the owner. And where do we find this? Titanan, as we learned in the Mishnah says, Ha'isha shehiviyah chatasa, let's say a woman brings her carbon chatos, v'meisa, and she dies. This is talking about a woman who gave birth, a yoledes, so she's supposed to bring a carbon chatas, she's supposed to bring a carbon ola. If she already brought her chatas and she died, yaviu yarshin olasa. So then the yarshin, the heirs, they can bring her ola. Olasa v'meisa. Now if she already brought her ola and then she died, lo yaviu yarshin chatasa. So then the yarshim, they do not bring her carbon chatas. And Rashi explains, Hachi Garcian, and the following is the proper text. Rami Reish Lakish al Ma'ohi. Reish Lakish was lying on his stomach. Shochev al bitno panav klape karki. He was lying on his stomach facing the ground. Lama hein boin. And so again, why you bring the carbon? Ve'akati lo kamalei taima de masnisin the alfinon mimotzas fasecha. Now, Reish Lakish, when he was asking this question, he didn't yet understand the answer that it comes from the pasuk of motzas fasecha ve'in meratzin. And so then Rebbe Elazar responded, we find the same idea by a carbon brought after death, that it's kosher but it's not meratza. And the idea is she'in kapara lemesim. There's no kapara, there's no atonement for the dead. Ve'afatal tatama leilu. And so therefore, since we find this when it comes to karbonos by someone who died, so the same should be true by a carbon shelo lishma. Ha'isha yoledes, again a woman, we're talking about a yoledes. Lo yaviu yarshin chatasa. So we make a distinction here between a carbon ola and a carbon chatas. When it comes to a carbon ola, the yarshim bring the carbon. When it comes to a chatas, they don't. The havel chatas shemesu ba'aleh. The reason is because by a chatas, there's a halacha of a chatas where the owner died. V'hilchas gemiri law. There's a halacha l'moshe misinai, the lemisa azla, that the animal has to be the animal has to die. And so therefore, again, since we find that this carbon ola is brought la'achar misa, so again, if it's lishma also, it's going to be considered a good carbon. And the Gemara continues, Amar lei. So Reish Lakish responded to Rebbe Elazar, Modino lach ba'ola, but I admit to you by ola. There I understand the asya la'achar misa, because again, as you just said, the ola can be brought even la'achar misa. So I understand that it can be brought when it's not lishma. But what about asham? What about a carbon asham? Now, carbon asham is not one of the exceptions according to the Tanakama of the Mishnah. According to the Tanakama of our Mishnah, carbon asham, you can still bring the carbon if it's shalom Shalol Lishma, but again, it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner. Now, it happens to be in the Mishnah, we're going to see in a moment, Rabbi Eliezer argued and actually said the Asham is completely disqualified just like a Chatas. Nevertheless, Reish Lakish now responds and says, I admit to you by Ola, because that you bring even Lachar Misa. But Asham, the Lo Asi Lachar Misa, but a carbon Asham, which you can't bring after death, Minolan. So from where do we know this idea? So Amar Leis, Rabbi Elazar said back, Hare Machlukascha B'tzida, but you see there's an argument right next to it that supports what you're saying. Because the Mishnah goes on to say, Rabbi Eliezer says, Afa Asham, that the same is true by Asham, so it actually is true. What you're saying is exactly true. By an Asham, which cannot be brought out Lachar Misa, according to Rabbi Eliezer at least, it can't be brought, it's completely disqualified when it's not Lishma. And the Gemara continues, Amar, so Reish Lakish said back, Zeu Sha'omer and Olav, Adam Gadol, who this is a person who they say is a great person, Ko'amino Ano Mishnah Shlema, I'm talking about a Mishnah Shlema. It means to say, I'm talking about the main opinion in the Mishnah, the unattributed Tanakama, that's the main opinion. V'ata Amritli Rabbi Eliezer, and you're bringing me the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Elam Reish Lakish, rather Reish Lakish says, Eftach Ano Pischal and Afshai, I have an opening for myself, I have an answer, and it's the answer we gave above. Motzos Vasecha V'gomer Hay Neder, Hay Nedava Neder Hu V'chulu Kidil El. Again, the same limud we had before, that in the pasuk of Motzos Vasecha, we had this on the previous Amud, it says both Nedava and Neder, and the idea is that it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner, the Neder, so to speak, of the owner, but it's brought as a Nedava, it can be brought nonetheless. And Rashi explains, Modina lach ba'ola, I admit by ola, shem shachta shalol lishman sheteskarev, over there, yeshechta shalol lishma, so then it should be offered, even though it's not going to fulfill any obligation of the owner. Ho'ola matzinu shabali achar misa, since we find that the ola can be brought after death, ve'ena maratza, and there also it's not maratza, because again, there's no ritzoi after death. V'huadin l'shlamim, and the same would be true by a shlamim, just like an ola. Ushar karbonos, and other karbonos also, chutz mechatos, except with the exception of a carbon chatos, and the Bach here puts in the word upesach, except for the carbon chatos and the carbon pesach, and then the Bach has the girsa miu asham. Nevertheless, when it comes to asham, de lo asi la'achar misa, that you can't bring after death, to kaimulon, to chol shebechatos mesa, because the halacha is, anytime a carbon chatos has to die, like in a situation where the owner died, be asham roes, so by a carbon asham, you just leave it to graze, you don't offer the carbon, and minolon, so then the question is by asham, how do we know the kar of shalol lishman, that if it's, let's say, shalol lishman, that you still offer it, whole ve'eno maratza, since it's not maratza, the lo apik tana de masis and ela pesach v'chatos, because again, the only exceptions according to the Tanakama are carbon pesach and carbon chatos, and so essentially the question is, what about carbon asham? Why is it that this carbon is being brought and not maratza if that's a carbon that cannot be brought after death? And the response was, machlukascha v'siyatzcha de'ikar Rabbi Eliezer, dekai kavasach. But Rabbi Eliezer says exactly like you. He also says the asham is totally disqualified. And Reish Lakish responded, Mishnah Shalema, I'm bringing you a full Mishnah, stam masnisin, meaning an unattributed Mishnah, de lo pasel ela chatos, that it's only by chatos, and again, the Bach puts in Upesach, the only exceptions are Chatas and Karban Pesach, but then Pischal and Afshoy, then he brought his own answer, Menol and Dekarvi, again, that comes from the Pasuk that we quoted, of Motzos Vasecha. And the Gemara continues, Yosef Rabbi Zeira Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba v'Yosef Abaya Gabayu. Rabbi Zeira and Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba, they were sitting, and Abaya was sitting by them, v'Yosef v'Ko Amri, and they were sitting and saying, Kasha lei l'Reish Lakish Asham. As we said above, there was a difficulty to Reish Lakish. Why is it that by Asham, de lo asi la'achar misaf, and Asham can't be brought after death, so why is it being brought over here, Shalol Lishma, but not fulfilling the obligation of the owner? V'nosav la Talmuda Motzos Vasecha. And so then the answer is learned from the pasuk of Motzos Vasecha. Now the issue is that the pasuk of Motzos Vasecha is talking clearly about Nedarim and Nedavos, which generally would not be a carbon asham. That would be something like an Ola or a Shalamim. So Ema haba bin Neder uv Nedava laisi v'lolir. See, if you're learning from that pasuk, so then we should say something that can be brought as a Neder or as a Nedava. So then we should say that it's brought and it's not going to atone, so to speak. It's not going to fulfill an obligation of the owner. But asham lo laisi cloud, but that wouldn't include a carbon asham. A carbon asham still you shouldn't bring it all. So that was the question they had on this answer from Motzos Vasecha. Amar Luhu Abayis. Abayis said to them, Reish Lakish mehacha pasach. Actually, Reish Lakish is not really learning it from Motzos Vasecha. That was incorrect. We'll see Rashi in a moment. But really, Reish Lakish is learning it from a different pasuk. V'shachat osah lechatos. It says you're going to shecht it as a chatos. Osah lishma kasheira, shalo lishma psula. Osah meaning the chatos. If it's lishma, it's kosher. If it's not lishma, it's totally disqualified. Hashar kachim, but other kachim, shalo lishma ksherin, even if it's shalol lishma, it will be kosher. So we're really learning it from the fact that it's just by a chatos, osa, only by a chatos, but other karbanos are going to be kosher, even shalol lishma. Now yachol yirtzu. Now one might think not only are they kosher, but they should fulfill the obligation of the owner. Talmud lomar motzos vasecha. The pasuk says motzos vasecha. So that's the part that motzos vasecha is teaching us. And Rashi explains, Reish Lakish mehacha pasach la Reish Lakish is learning from here, lo nafkalemi motzos vasecha delikar. If he's not learning from motzos vasecha that they can be brought as a carbon, they can be offered. Ela delo lirtzi, rather motzos vasecha is saying that it's not going to fulfill the obligation of the owner. V'hakravaso mehaikrayolf, and the fact that it can be offered, that comes from the following pasuk, v'shachat osa lechatos, it says you're going to shecht it as a chatos, osa miyutahu, the word osa is an exclusion. Osahu deba'in l'shma, there we require l'shma, and if not, it's disqualified. Hashar kachim, but when it comes to other kachim, they are kosher. But the Gemara continues and asks, Ve'ema, but why don't we say, Haba bin neder nedava laisi velo lirtzi? Things, karbanos that can be brought as a neder or nedava, again, like an ola or shlamim, maybe they are brought, but they don't fulfill the obligation of the owner. But maybe we should say that asham, ertsuye nami lirtzi, let's go even further and say that a karban asham, actually, it even is maratze. We'll even say that it fulfills the obligation of the owner. And to that the Gemara says, Amar Abaya says, Asham demirtzi lo matzas amrin. You can't possibly say that the Asham completely fulfills the obligation of the owner and goes beyond an Ola and a Shlamim, because Kal v'chomer me'Ola, you should make a Kal v'chomer from Ola, that cannot be the case. Uma Ola she'ena mechaperes, if an Ola, which is not even a kapora, it's not an atonement, so Eino meratza, so it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner. Asham she'mechaper, when it comes to an Asham which is actually brought as an atonement, Eino din she'eno meratza, certainly it should not be able to fulfill any obligation of the owner. The Gemara says, well, Mala Ola Shekain Kolel, but maybe Ola is different because the entire Ola is brought on the Mizbeach. But the Gemara says Shlamim Yochichu, but Shlamim will still prove the other way because that's not it's not Kolel, it's not all burned on the Mizbeach. But Mala Shlamim Shekain Tu'unin Nesachim Utnufas Chazav Eshok, but Shlamim is unique because Shlamim has Nesachim, and it has Tanufas Chazav Eshok, the waving of the Chaza and the Shok, and so that also has a unique element. Ola Tochiach, Ola can prove the other way because it's not exactly like Shlamim. V'chazar, then you go back and forth to make a tzad hashava. Lo roizeh karoizeh, v'lo roizeh karoizeh. This one is not like this one is not like that one. Hatzad hashava shebohen, and so the common denominator is shein kachim, that they're karbonos. V'shachtan shalo lishman ksherin ve'ein meratzin, and if you slaughter them not lishma, they are kosher, but they're not going to fulfill the obligation of the owner. Afani avi asham, so too I can include asham shu kodesh, that is a carbon, v'shachtu shalo lishmo kosher, ve'eino meratz. And again, if you slaughter it shalo lishmo, so it's going to be kosher, but it will not fulfill the obligation of the owner. The Gemara says, Mala tzad hashava shebehen shekain yeshno b'tzibur, but the tzad hashava, the common denominator between Ola and Shlamim is at least they apply in a carbon tzibur. Both of them can apply in a public carbon. The Gemara says, well, toda tochiach, a carbon toda is not b'tzibur, that's not a communal carbon, and that can prove the other way. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Hey Amid Beis.